The alarm wasn't screaming, the lights weren't flashing, and yet everything was already wrong. One line on a screen altered by a single digit was enough to destroy a life by morning. He saw it, froze, and understood that pretending not to notice would be the easiest choice. Daniel was a single father who measured his days in school drop-offs, unpaid bills, and borrowed minutes of sleep. Since his wife's death, stability had become a fragile illusion he protected for his son at all costs. He worked a job few people remembered existed, one designed to run quietly in the background. It paid just enough to survive and demanded just enough silence to stay invisible. Daniel had learned that invisibility was sometimes mistaken for safety. That night, exhaustion clung to him as tightly as the thought of losing the only income keeping his household afloat. His supervisor expected routine, compliance, and signatures, not questions that slowed production or embarrassed managers. The system in front of him was supposed to be boring, predictable, and unquestioned. But boredom shattered the moment Daniel noticed the discrepancy that no training manual mentioned. Reporting it would mean delays, investigations, and attention he could not afford. Ignoring it would mean clocking out on time and tucking his son into bed with a clean conscience that felt counterfeit. No policy explained what to do when responsibility collided directly with survival. Daniel did not think of himself as brave, ethical, or heroic in any formal sense. He thought of a small voice asking why adults lied so easily and why rules only mattered sometimes. In that moment, the risk was not dramatic or cinematic, but slow, financial, and deeply personal. The choice he faced would not explode instantly, yet it would echo through weeks, months, and a child's memory. This is the story of a man who stood at that quiet intersection and chose to be seen. Daniel's shift officially began at 5 p.m., but in reality, his workday started hours earlier. It began with reheated pasta scraped into mismatched containers, a reminder slipped into his son's backpack, and a silent calculation of how many days remained before the rent deadline turned from a number into a threat. By the time he locked the apartment door behind him, his shoulders already carried a weight that had nothing to do with his job title. The building where Daniel worked was not dangerous in any obvious way. There were no flickering lights, no warning sirens, no urgent signs posted in red. It was modern, clean, and designed to look efficient rather than impressive. People passed through its doors every day without thinking twice, trusting that whatever happened inside was being managed by someone else. That assumption was the building's greatest strength and its quietest flaw. Daniel's role existed precisely because no one wanted to think about what could go wrong. He was responsible for monitoring internal systems, reviewing logs, and ensuring that processes ran as expected after most employees had gone home. It was not a position of authority. He could observe, document, and escalate, but he could not change outcomes on his own. His presence was meant to reassure the company, not disrupt it. He had learned quickly that the unspoken rule of his job was simple: do not slow things down. Efficiency was praised, compliance rewarded, and silence interpreted as competence. The fewer questions you asked, the easier your shifts became. Most people who held his position understood this instinctively. They stayed just alert enough to avoid mistakes and just quiet enough to avoid attention. Daniel had once believed that doing a job well meant following instructions to the letter. Over time, experience had taught him a more complicated truth. Sometimes the instructions were incomplete, sometimes they were outdated, and sometimes they were designed not to protect people, but to protect appearances. None of this was written down, yet everyone seemed to understand it. On paper, his tasks were straightforward. Review the reports generated by automated systems. Compare them against baseline expectations. Flag anything that fell outside the acceptable range. In practice, those acceptable ranges were flexible, adjusted over time by managers who valued continuity over disruption. Deviations were tolerated if they didn't immediately cause problems. Small inconsistencies were smoothed over, logged as within operational variance, and quietly forgotten. Daniel did not arrive at his station that evening expecting anything unusual. He was tired, distracted, and already thinking about the morning ahead. His son had a school presentation later that week, and Daniel was trying to figure out whether he could afford to take time off without drawing attention to himself. He logged in, checked the schedule, and began reviewing the data the way he always did, slowly, methodically, without expectation. That was when he noticed the number. At first, it didn't register as a problem. It was a single data point, buried among hundreds of others, presented in a format designed to discourage scrutiny. The value was technically within tolerance, but only if one accepted a recent adjustment that had never been formally explained. Daniel frowned, leaned closer to the screen, and pulled up the previous records. The discrepancy became clearer as he traced the pattern backward. The same metric had been gradually shifting over time, nudged slightly in one direction, then normalized through revised thresholds rather than corrected at the source. Someone had chosen to redefine acceptable instead of addressing the underlying issue. It was subtle, clever, and disturbingly effective. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He had seen this before in other jobs, other systems, other companies. Not this exact issue, but the same logic. Problems that were not fixed, only reframed. Risks that were managed by adjusting language rather than behavior. It was how organizations avoided accountability while maintaining plausible deniability. He checked the documentation. The most recent approval bore a digital signature from a manager several levels above him. The notes were brief, carefully worded, and intentionally vague. No instructions were attached, no follow-up scheduled. The system, according to the records, was functioning as intended. Daniel leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He knew what would happen if he flagged the issue. The process would stall. Questions would be asked. Someone would need to explain decisions they had hoped would never be revisited. And because Daniel was new and replaceable, that attention would not fall evenly. He also knew what would happen if he didn't. The shift would end quietly. The logs would remain clean. He would go home, make breakfast, and listen to his son talk about school as if the world was stable and predictable. The issue would remain dormant, not gone, just postponed. This was the kind of problem that thrived on delay. It didn't demand immediate action. It didn't announce itself with urgency. It relied on the human tendency to prioritize the present over the potential, comfort over confrontation. Daniel understood why others had ignored it. He understood why the system had been built this way. What he didn't understand was when silence had become the default expectation rather than a warning sign. He thought about the training session during his first week, when a senior employee had pulled him aside afterward. "You'll do fine here," the man had said, lowering his voice. "Just don't overthink things. If something was important, someone higher up would have already handled it." At the time, Daniel had nodded. Now the memory unsettled him. The phrase "someone higher up" had always bothered him. It suggested responsibility without presence, authority without visibility. It allowed everyone else to step back, trusting that accountability existed somewhere beyond reach. Daniel opened a new window and began documenting what he saw, not because he had decided what to do, but because he needed clarity. He recorded timestamps, referenced older entries, and noted where thresholds had been altered. The act of writing grounded him, forced him to confront the issue in concrete terms rather than abstract discomfort. As the evidence accumulated, so did the implications. The discrepancy was not catastrophic on its own. It wouldn't cause immediate failure, but it increased vulnerability, reduced margins, and introduced a risk that compounded quietly over time. If something else went wrong, this flaw would amplify the damage. Daniel rested his forehead against his hand. He could already hear the arguments that would be used against him. It's theoretical. It hasn't caused harm. We've operated this way for months. Why are you bringing this up now? He glanced at the clock. 8:17 p.m. Still early in the shift. There was time to do nothing. Time to close the window, log the routine checks, and move on. No one was watching. No alert would trigger automatically. The system trusted him to decide what mattered. And that, more than anything else, unsettled him. This job did not require him to be heroic. It required him to be invisible, consistent, and compliant. It rewarded those who understood the difference between responsibility and blame and avoided the latter at all costs. Daniel had taken the job because he needed stability, not because he wanted to challenge anyone. Yet sitting there, staring at a problem that existed only because so many people had chosen not to see it, he felt something shift, not anger, not fear, but a growing awareness that the cost of silence was not evenly distributed. It fell hardest on those who trusted systems they never questioned. Daniel closed the documentation window without submitting anything. Not yet. He needed to think. He needed to decide whether this was a battle he could afford to fight and whether the consequences of winning or losing would follow him home. Outside, the building hummed quietly, unaware of the decision forming inside one overlooked office. Inside Daniel, the weight of invisibility began to feel heavier than the risk of being seen. Daniel did not submit the report that night, not because he had decided to stay silent, but because he needed to understand exactly what silence would cost. He spent the next hour doing what he had always done well, working quietly, carefully, and without drawing attention. He cross-checked historical data, traced changes across reporting cycles, and mapped how the altered threshold interacted with other systems. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became that the discrepancy was not an accident. It was the result of intentional adjustment, repeated just often enough to normalize what should have raised concern. This was not negligence in the traditional sense. No one had forgotten to do their job. Someone had done it too well, tidying up the numbers so they fit expectations rather than reality. Daniel recognized the pattern from past jobs. It usually began with pressure, a deadline, a budget cut, an inconvenient problem that threatened to slow everything down. Someone made a small compromise, telling themselves it was temporary. That compromise became a workaround. The workaround became policy. And policy, once written, was rarely questioned by those who inherited it. The system Daniel monitored relied heavily on trust. It assumed that each layer of oversight had done its job honestly. But trust, he knew, was fragile when accountability dissolved into abstraction. Everyone trusted the system. No one trusted themselves enough to challenge it. By 9:30 p.m., the building was nearly empty. The day staff had gone home, and the night crew moved through their routines with the practiced detachment of people who knew their work would never be noticed unless something went wrong. Daniel watched them through the security feed, cleaners pushing carts, maintenance staff checking off lists, all of them focused on tasks that kept the machine running smoothly. He wondered how many of them trusted that the systems protecting them were being monitored by someone who cared. Daniel's phone vibrated softly against the desk. A message from his son's after-school program reminded him about the presentation later that week. Parents were encouraged to attend. Daniel stared at the screen longer than necessary, feeling the familiar tension tighten in his chest. Attendance meant time off. Time off meant questions. Questions meant risk. He locked his phone and returned his attention to the documentation. He could feel the pressure building, not the dramatic kind, but the slow, grinding kind that wore people down over time. This was the kind of decision that didn't explode in a moment. It unfolded quietly, shaping the future in ways that were impossible to predict. At 10:12 p.m., his supervisor appeared in the system chat. "Everything normal tonight?" the message read. Daniel hesitated before responding. The word normal felt heavier than it should have. "All systems operational," he typed back, choosing accuracy without disclosure. It was a half-truth and he knew it. The system was operating, yes, but not as intended. The reply came quickly. "Good. Let me know if anything urgent comes up." Urgent. Another word that allowed interpretation to replace responsibility. Daniel imagined what would happen if he flagged the issue now. The supervisor would escalate it reluctantly, framing it as a minor concern. Management would ask why it hadn't been noticed earlier. Someone would review the logs, see Daniel's name attached to the alert, and decide whether he was a problem worth addressing. He had seen how organizations treated people who disrupted their sense of order, not with outright hostility, but with subtle exclusion, shifts reassigned, contracts not renewed, conversations that happened without you in the room. For someone with savings and options, that risk might be manageable. For Daniel, it was existential. He thought about his son again, not in the abstract, but vividly. The way he struggled to pronounce certain words when nervous, the careful handwriting on homework sheets, the absolute certainty with which he believed his father could fix anything. Daniel had never corrected that belief. He didn't want to explain how often he felt powerless. Around 11 p.m., Daniel stepped away from the screen and walked the length of the operations floor. The hum of machines was constant, reassuring in its consistency. Everything sounded fine. Everything looked fine. That was the danger. He stopped near a window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, families were eating late dinners, finishing homework, preparing for another ordinary day built on invisible assumptions. They trusted systems they would never see, maintained by people they would never meet. Daniel understood that his job placed him at an uncomfortable intersection between knowledge and authority. He could see problems without being empowered to fix them. The organization relied on that imbalance. It allowed information to exist without forcing action. At midnight, Daniel returned to his desk and reopened the documentation. He added a note he hadn't planned to write: potential downstream impact under compounded failure conditions. It was careful language, deliberately restrained. He wasn't accusing anyone. He wasn't predicting disaster. He was simply stating that the issue mattered. His finger hovered over the Submit for Review button. The system did not require him to act immediately. There was no automated reminder, no escalation timer. He could wait until the end of his shift. He could wait until the next one. Delay was built into the design. Daniel pulled his hand back and closed the window again. He needed more than data. He needed certainty, not that he was right, but that he could live with whatever came next. The rest of the shift passed slowly. He completed his routine checks, responded to minor alerts, and exchanged brief messages with colleagues. No one mentioned the discrepancy. No alarms sounded. The world continued functioning as if nothing were wrong. By the time his shift ended at 2 a.m., Daniel felt more exhausted than usual, not physically, but mentally, as if he had been holding his breath for hours without realizing it. At home, he moved quietly so as not to wake his son. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him sleep. The room was small, but it felt safe. That safety depended on things Daniel could not fully control. He lay awake long after, replaying the night in his mind. He thought about the people who had adjusted the thresholds, the managers who had approved them, the supervisors who trusted the system because trusting it made their jobs easier. None of them were villains. That was what made it harder. The next evening, Daniel returned to work with a decision still unmade. The discrepancy was still there, unchanged. The system had not corrected itself. The data had not shifted back. If anything, the numbers had inched further toward the edge of acceptability. Daniel opened the documentation one last time and read through everything he had written. It was factual, restrained, and impossible to dismiss without deliberate effort. Submitting it would not guarantee action. It would only guarantee visibility. He took a deep breath and pressed the button. The confirmation message appeared instantly. Report submitted for preliminary review. There was no dramatic sound, no warning, no sense of finality, just a quiet acknowledgement that the system had received his concern. Daniel leaned back in his chair, heart pounding harder than he expected. He felt no relief, only a strange, hollow calm. The decision had been made. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. At 2:17 a.m., a new message appeared in the system chat. "Why was this escalated?" his supervisor wrote. Daniel stared at the words, knowing this was only the beginning. The question sat on Daniel's screen longer than it should have. Why was this escalated? There was no accusation in the wording, no explicit warning. It was professional, neutral, almost polite. That was what made it dangerous. Daniel had learned that the most consequential moments in organizations rarely arrived with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. They came quietly, wrapped in reasonable language that shifted the burden of explanation onto the person least equipped to carry it. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he read the message again, then once more, as if the meaning might change. It didn't. The question wasn't really about the report, it was about him, about whether he understood the unspoken boundaries of his role and whether he was willing to stay within them. Daniel typed a response, erased it, and typed again. Each version sounded either defensive or insufficient. Finally, he settled on something simple. "I noticed a deviation that appears to have been normalized through threshold adjustments. I documented the pattern and submitted it for review." He pressed send before he could reconsider. The reply did not come right away. Minutes passed. The operations floor remained quiet, the hum of systems steady and indifferent. Daniel felt a familiar tension building behind his eyes, the kind that came from waiting for consequences you could neither predict nor prevent. When the response finally arrived, it was shorter than the first. "Understood. Let's discuss tomorrow." Tomorrow. Another word that created space without offering clarity. Daniel finished the rest of his shift on autopilot. He followed procedures, completed his checks, and avoided opening the system dashboard again. The report was out there now, moving through channels he couldn't see. His involvement would be remembered whether the issue was addressed or dismissed. Visibility, once gained, was not easily reversed. At home, sleep refused to come. Daniel lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the apartment. The refrigerator cycling on and off, a car passing on the street below, his son's soft breathing from the next room. Each sound grounded him in a reality that felt increasingly fragile. He wondered whether he had been reckless. The discrepancy wasn't catastrophic. It might never cause harm. Had he risked everything over a hypothetical? The thought gnawed at him, persistent and insidious. Morning arrived too soon. Daniel moved through the routine mechanically. Breakfast, backpacks, shoes by the door. His son chatted about school, unaware of the weight pressing against his father's silence. Daniel responded when necessary, smiled when expected, and tried not to let the anxiety bleed into his voice. After the drop-off, he sat in the car for several minutes before driving away. He gripped the steering wheel and stared straight ahead, feeling the pull of two competing truths. One told him he had done what was right. The other reminded him that being right did not pay rent. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon. Daniel arrived early, as he always did, and waited in a small conference room that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and stale coffee. The walls were bare, the table scratched from years of use. This was not a room where decisions were made, only clarified. His supervisor entered first, followed by a manager Daniel had seen only in passing. Neither smiled. "Thanks for coming in," the manager said, taking a seat across from him. "We wanted to understand your thinking." Daniel nodded, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The conversation unfolded predictably. They asked him to walk through what he had observed. He explained the data, the pattern, the documentation. He spoke carefully, sticking to facts, avoiding speculation. He had learned that tone mattered as much as content. When he finished, the manager leaned back in his chair. "We've been operating with those thresholds for some time," he said. "They were approved at the appropriate level." "I understand," Daniel replied. "My concern is the underlying cause hasn't been addressed." The supervisor exchanged a glance with the manager. "Daniel," the supervisor said, lowering his voice slightly, "you're still new here. There's a context you might not be fully aware of." The words were gentle, but the message was clear. "You don't see the whole picture." "I'm sure there's context I don't have," Daniel said. "That's why I escalated it for review." The manager sighed, as if disappointed rather than angry. "We appreciate diligence," he said, "but escalation creates ripple effects. It pulls resources, triggers audits, and raises questions that may not need to be raised." Daniel nodded slowly. He had expected this. "I wasn't trying to create disruption," he said. "I was trying to ensure accuracy." The meeting ended without resolution. They told him the issue would be looked into and thanked him for bringing it forward. No reassurance was offered, no guidance given. The ambiguity lingered like a fog. Over the next week, Daniel felt the shift in subtle ways. His name disappeared from certain schedules. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Requests he sent took longer to be answered, if they were answered at all. No one said anything outright. They didn't need to. Isolation was not enforced through punishment, but through omission. At home, the pressure began to show. Daniel found himself snapping over small things, his patience thinning under the constant strain. He apologized quickly, but the guilt lingered. He had wanted to model integrity for his son, not anxiety. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table working on homework, his son looked up at him. "Are you mad at me?" he asked. The question caught Daniel off guard. "No," he said immediately. "Why would you think that?" "You've been quiet," his son replied, "like when you're thinking too hard." Daniel swallowed. "Just tired," he said. His son nodded, accepting the answer, and returned to his work. Children often did that, accepted partial truths because they trusted the people who gave them. At work, the report stalled. No updates arrived. The system continued operating as before. The discrepancy remained, documented but unaddressed. Daniel began to wonder whether visibility had been enough or whether silence would ultimately win. Then, one afternoon, an email arrived. "Effective immediately, your contract will not be renewed beyond the current term." No explanation, no reference to performance issues. Just a formal conclusion delivered with administrative precision. Daniel read the message twice, then closed his laptop. The room felt suddenly very small. He told himself not to be surprised. He had known this was a possibility. Still, knowing something intellectually did not make it easier to absorb emotionally. The loss of income loomed immediately, practical and unforgiving. That night, he sat alone at the kitchen table long after his son had gone to bed. He made lists, expenses, contacts, potential jobs. The familiar ritual brought a measure of control, but it could not quiet the doubt. Had he made a mistake? He thought again of the discrepancy, of the way it had been hidden in plain sight. He thought of the managers who had chosen convenience over correction, and of the system that rewarded them for it. He wondered how many others had noticed similar issues and learned to look away. In the days that followed, Daniel adjusted. He applied for new positions, reached out to old contacts, recalculated everything. He did not mention the report in interviews. He did not frame himself as a whistleblower. He needed work, not validation. Life went on, uneven and uncertain. Then weeks later, something changed. A former colleague called him late one evening. "They're auditing everything," the man said quietly. "External review. Full sweep." Daniel's heart quickened. Why now? Because something else failed, the colleague replied. Not catastrophic, but close enough to scare people. Your report came up. The call ended quickly. There was nothing more to say. Daniel sat in the dark, the weight of the moment settling over him. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep, complicated sadness that it had taken a near miss for anyone to pay attention. He did not know what would come next, whether the audit would lead to changes or whether the system would find a way to absorb the shock and continue as before. He only knew that the discrepancy had refused to stay small, and that somehow mattered. Daniel learned about the investigation the same way he learned about most things lately: secondhand, incomplete, and too late to influence. The audit did not come with an apology or an acknowledgement. It arrived quietly, wrapped in official language and redirected responsibilities, as if the organization were attempting to correct a structural flaw without admitting that anyone had noticed it in the first place. The first sign was an email forwarded by a former colleague. It was brief, impersonal, and carefully neutral. External consultants had been brought in to conduct a comprehensive operational review. All departments were instructed to cooperate fully. Documentation protocols were being revised. Reporting pathways were temporarily suspended pending evaluation. Daniel read the message without emotion. He had learned not to expect recognition from systems designed to erase individual contributions. The audit was not about him. It was about risk containment. Still, something shifted. Over the next several weeks, fragments of information reached him through informal channels. A manager had been reassigned. A long-standing vendor contract was under review. Historical data was being re-examined against original benchmarks rather than adjusted thresholds. The discrepancy Daniel had reported, once dismissed as theoretical, had become part of a broader pattern no one could ignore anymore. The irony was difficult to miss. The organization responded not to the warning itself, but to the proof that ignoring it had nearly caused measurable harm. It was a familiar lesson, one Daniel had seen repeated across industries and roles. Preventive action rarely received credit. Reactive correction, however costly, was easier to justify. Daniel's own life, meanwhile, had narrowed. Without steady work, his days became structured around uncertainty. He filled out applications in the mornings, followed up in the afternoons, and worked temporary shifts when he could find them. Each opportunity came with its own version of the same unspoken question. Will you cause problems here? He learned how to answer without lying. He described himself as detail-oriented, reliable, and focused on process improvement. He avoided words like escalation or risk exposure. Language, he had discovered, was often the difference between being heard and being filtered out. At home, he worked hard to preserve normalcy. He woke his son at the same time each morning, packed lunches with the same quiet efficiency, and attended school events when possible. The presentation he had worried about weeks earlier went ahead as planned. His son stood in front of the class, nervous but determined, explaining a project that mattered deeply to him. Daniel watched from the back of the room, hands clasped tightly together. He felt pride, yes, but also a sharp awareness of how fragile this stability was. One missed paycheck, one unexpected expense, and everything could tilt. Afterward, as they walked home together, his son looked up at him. "Did I do okay?" he asked. "You did great," Daniel said, meaning it. His son nodded, satisfied, then added, "I told them you fix things." Daniel smiled despite himself. "I try." The statement lingered with him long after. "I try." It was the most honest description of his life he could think of. Weeks passed. The audit continued. The organization released no public statements. There was no scandal, no headlines, no dramatic reckoning, just a quiet recalibration of systems that would eventually be presented as proactive improvement rather than overdue correction. One afternoon, Daniel received a call from a number he did not recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another recruiter offering a position that would go nowhere. Something made him answer. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and unfamiliar. The caller introduced herself as part of the external review team. She said his name carefully as if testing it. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about a report you submitted several months ago," she said. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. "Am I in trouble?" "No," she replied quickly. "We're trying to understand how certain issues were identified and how they were handled internally." He agreed to speak with her later that week. The interview was thorough but respectful. She asked about what he had seen, how he had documented it, and what response he had received. Daniel answered honestly, sticking to facts, resisting the urge to editorialize. He did not frame himself as a victim or a hero. He simply described the process as he had experienced it. When the call ended, he felt drained but strangely lighter. For the first time, someone had listened without trying to redirect the conversation away from discomfort. Nothing came of it immediately. Life continued in its uneven rhythm. Daniel took on short-term work, adjusted budgets, and learned how to live with fewer certainties. He did not regret his decision, but neither did he romanticize it. Integrity, he had learned, did not insulate you from consequences. It simply clarified which ones you were willing to accept. Then one evening, another message arrived. This one was different. It was not from his former employer, nor from the audit team. It was from a company he had applied to weeks earlier and mentally written off. They were offering him a position, not high-ranking, not glamorous, but stable. The role involved oversight, process review, and internal reporting. The salary was modest but sufficient, the schedule predictable. Daniel read the offer slowly, measuring not just the numbers but the tone. The job description emphasized transparency, accountability, and early identification of issues. It sounded almost aspirational. During the interview that followed, the hiring manager asked a question Daniel had come to expect. "Tell me about a time you raised a concern that wasn't well received." Daniel paused, then told the story. Not in detail, not dramatically, but honestly. He explained the discrepancy, the escalation, the outcome. He did not embellish the ending. The manager listened without interrupting. "Would you do it again?" she asked when he finished. Daniel thought of his son, of the quiet apartment, of the months of uncertainty. "Yes," he said, "I would." She nodded. "That's why we called you." The job did not change everything overnight. Money remained tight. Stress did not disappear. But something fundamental shifted. Daniel no longer felt like an anomaly, a problem to be managed. He felt, for the first time in a long while, aligned with the work he was doing. Back at his former organization, the audit concluded quietly. Processes were updated, reporting structures were clarified. Several individuals moved on, though no official reasons were given. The discrepancy that had once been normalized was corrected, absorbed into a broader narrative of improvement. Daniel was not mentioned. He did not expect to be. What surprised him was how little that mattered now. One evening, as he helped his son with homework, the boy looked up and asked, "Did you fix the thing at your old job?" Daniel considered the question. "I helped," he said finally. His son smiled. "That's good." It was enough. Daniel had learned that consequences did not always arrive in the form of justice or reward. Sometimes they came as alignment, a slow, imperfect realignment between values and reality. The organization had changed, not because one person demanded it, but because reality eventually made denial impossible. And Daniel had changed too. He no longer believed that doing the right thing guaranteed a positive outcome, but he understood more clearly than ever that it defined the kind of life he was willing to build. The consequences of his decision had moved slowly, unevenly, and without ceremony, yet they had moved. And that movement, however subtle, had been worth the cost. Stability did not arrive with celebration. It came quietly, almost suspiciously, like a sound you didn't trust because life had trained you to expect disruption. Daniel's new job settled into his routine without demanding that he become someone else. There were no speeches about values, no grand promises of transformation, just clear expectations, documented processes, and a shared understanding that raising concerns was not an inconvenience but a responsibility. It felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping onto solid ground after months of compensating for imbalance. He learned the system slowly, deliberately. He asked questions not to test limits, but to understand them. No one flinched. No one redirected him with vague reassurances. When he flagged inconsistencies, they were discussed, not always fixed immediately, but acknowledged. That alone felt radical. The work was not glamorous. It would never make headlines, but it allowed Daniel to sleep at night without replaying decisions in his head, without wondering which version of himself he would have to explain to his son someday. At home, life softened around the edges. The new job didn't eliminate stress, but it redistributed it. Bills still needed paying. Choices still required compromise. Yet the constant low-grade fear of sudden collapse eased. Daniel found himself laughing more easily, listening more patiently, present in ways he hadn't been when survival consumed all available attention. His son noticed the difference before Daniel did. "You're not so quiet anymore," the boy said one evening as they ate dinner. Daniel paused. "Is that good or bad?" His son considered this seriously. "Good," he decided. "Quiet makes me think you're worried." Daniel nodded, absorbing the truth of it. Some nights, after homework and dishes were done, they sat together on the couch watching shows that neither of them cared much about. The comfort wasn't in the content, but in the shared silence, the kind that didn't ask questions or demand explanations. Weeks turned into months. The audit at Daniel's former workplace concluded its outcomes absorbed into internal documentation that would never be public. The organization moved on, adjusted, recalibrated. New procedures replaced old ones. New language reframed past decisions. The system survived, as systems often do. Occasionally, Daniel wondered about the people still there, the supervisors who had deflected responsibility, the managers who had discouraged escalation. He did not hate them. He understood them too well for that. They were people navigating structures that rewarded comfort over courage, continuity over correction. Understanding, he had learned, did not require agreement. One afternoon, while reviewing a routine report at his new job, Daniel caught himself smiling. The realization startled him. Work had become something he did, not something he endured. The distinction mattered more than he had expected. Later that week, his son came home with a permission slip for a school event, Career Day. Parents were invited to talk briefly about what they did. "Can you come?" his son asked, already bracing for disappointment. Daniel hesitated only long enough to check his schedule. "Yes," he said, "I can." The day arrived with the kind of nervous energy only children could generate. Daniel stood in a classroom filled with parents describing professions that sounded impressive even when they weren't fully understood. Engineers, designers, consultants. When it was his turn, Daniel kept it simple. "I help make sure systems work the way they're supposed to," he said. "And when they don't, I help people notice before it becomes a problem." A few children nodded politely. His son beamed. On the walk home, the boy asked, "Is that what you did before too?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "I tried," he said. His son accepted the answer without pressing further. That night, after his son had gone to bed, Daniel stood by the window and looked out at the city. Lights flickered on and off in distant buildings, each one full of people who trusted structures they would never examine. He felt no urge to warn them, no burden to carry the weight of their assumptions. He had learned the limits of responsibility. You could not fix everything. You could not save everyone, But you could decide where you would not lie. Daniel's phone buzzed softly with a message from a former colleague, someone still at the old organization. They changed the reporting system, the message read. Your report is cited in the internal rationale, not by name, but yeah. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment, then set the phone down. Recognition had arrived, late and diluted, stripped of personal attribution. Once, that might have bothered him. Now, it felt exactly right. The work had mattered, even if the credit did not. He realized then that the story he had lived was not about courage in the dramatic sense. It was about endurance, the willingness to accept short-term loss for long-term coherence. It was about refusing to outsource conscience to process. Most of all, it was about what remained when the noise faded. One evening, as Daniel tucked his son into bed, the boy asked a question that lingered. Why do people pretend not to see things? He asked. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, thinking. Sometimes it's easier, he said. Sometimes they're scared of what happens if they don't pretend. His son frowned. Is pretending bad? Not always, Daniel said slowly. But if you do it too much, you forget who you are. The boy nodded as if this made perfect sense, then rolled over and closed his eyes. Daniel stayed a moment longer, listening to the steady rhythm of sleep. He felt no certainty about the future, no guarantees, no illusions of control. But he felt something steadier than certainty. He felt aligned. In the months that followed, life continued in its unremarkable way. There were hard days and easier ones. Moments of doubt still surfaced, but they no longer dominated. Daniel had learned that integrity did not make life simpler. It made it clearer. He no longer measured success by comfort alone, nor failure by loss. He measured it by whether he could stand still in his own decisions without needing to justify them. The discrepancy that once threatened his livelihood had become a reference point, not a defining trauma, but a quiet reminder. When faced with ambiguity, he knew what kind of person he would be, and that knowledge once earned could not be taken away. Years from now, his son might not remember the details. He wouldn't recall audits or reports or threshold adjustments, but he would remember something else, the tone of conversations, the absence of bitterness, the way his father answered questions without evasion. He would remember a man who did not always win, but who did not disappear either. When the noise faded, when the systems recalibrated and the consequences settled, what remained was simple and unremarkable and profoundly human. A father who chose to be seen, a life shaped not by comfort, but by coherence, and a quiet understanding that some choices echo far beyond the moment they are made, even if no one is watching. In the end, nothing about Daniel's life looked extraordinary from the outside. There was no headline with his name, no public apology, no dramatic reward that rewrote his story overnight. The systems adjusted, the organization moved on. The world kept turning exactly as it always does. But something quieter and far more important had changed. Daniel learned that doing the right thing does not guarantee safety, success, or recognition. It guarantees something harder to define and harder to replace. The ability to live without editing your own memories, to look back at a moment of pressure and know you did not disappear when it mattered. Most people will never be asked to make a choice that feels heroic. They will be asked to make choices that feel inconvenient, choices that cost comfort, stability, or silence, choices that no one applauds and no one notices. Those are the moments that shape a life. One day, Daniel's son will grow up. He will forget the details, the job titles, the systems, the long nights, but he will remember what it felt like to trust his father. He will remember a man who did not always take the easiest path, but always took the honest one. And maybe years from now, when he stands at his own quiet crossroads, when no one is watching, when pretending would be easier, when the system encourages him to look away, he will remember that integrity is not about winning. It is about remaining whole. Because at the end of every story, every career, every carefully built system, there's only one question that truly lasts. When it was easier to stay silent, who did you choose to be?